Hello, everybody. So the topic of today's conversation is the three V's: virus, vaccine, and ventilators. So you may ask, this is astrology channel, why are we talking about the virus all the time? Well, this astrology channel is all about unfolding events, what it means for all of us, the impact they're having. And so I think we need to get to grips with what's really going on. So from the beginning, I've been wondering, well, why is it that ventilators are such an issue with this particular pneumonia caused by COVID-19, if it is a pneumonia? Why is ventilation so important, and why is there this unprecedented demand for ventilators? So definitely going to be looking at that. Also going to be looking at vaccines. Now, we know that, well, quite frankly, I asked a friend who lives in Germany why he thought the German numbers were staying so well under control. And he said to me, well, they're giving patients hydroxychloroquine. Well, that was before it broke the news, but it wasn't until a few days later it became widespread in the news that this was what was being used. Now, I know President Trump was rather enthusiastic about it, and he ordered lots of supplies to be increased for that. But Fauci and Dr. Birx definitely don't seem to be on board with it. In fact, Fauci was saying the other day that the only way to get back to normal is once there's a vaccine and everyone can be vaccinated, and or saying that people can get back to work as soon as they've had the antibody or eventually had the vaccine. As I was saying in my broadcast the other day, Fauci and Dr. Birx are really plugged in to the whole medical industrial complex, of which Bill Gates with his vaccine push is a very big part, and therefore they are pushing us towards the vaccine. And as you know, that may be compulsory. It may involve all this digital tattooing with nanotechnology, vaccine passports, all that stuff. I'm sure you've heard other people speak about it, so I don't want to go into great detail. So I was curious, because they say that usually people get viral pneumonia, which can be treated with antibiotics, but because COVID is a virus, you would get viral pneumonia, which cannot be treated with antibiotics. So I asked a registered nurse, very experienced one, friend of mine, and I said, well, wouldn't it be true that if you've got the COVID and you get very run down, you could be susceptible to secondary bacterial infections, one of which could be pneumonia? So you could very well have COVID, but bacterial pneumonia. So she said that absolutely is what happens, and that's why in many cases they are treating the COVID with erythromycin, which is one of the brands of antibiotic that they have. I haven't heard penicillin used. And one of the other things they've been treating it with very effectively is with zinc. So the next question is this really a pneumonia? So I had a look on the NHS website, and they say that 1% of the British population get pneumonia every year. So that's, I'm assuming, since the last census, our population has grown. We've got a population of about 70 million. So that's 700,000 people get pneumonia every year in the UK, mainly in the winter months. So where are all those people? What are they doing? Where are they now? Now, most pneumonias can be treated at home, but some people are hospitalized. And I said to this RN friend of mine, what happens usually with pneumonia? Do you treat it with a ventilator? So she said, no, we don't. It's very non-invasive, the kind of therapies they do. So even if you get hospitalized with pneumonia, of which I think a sixth of people who get it do, especially the older patients, you don't get ventilated. So why the sudden mass use of ventilators? Well, I found this article in The Spectator, but it was reinforced by another article that I saw elsewhere. So what have we got here? This was by Dr. Matt Strauss, and it says ventilators are not a panacea for a pandemic like coronavirus. So first of all, they've talked about the cytokine storm. So I'm not quite sure if it's right to categorize what people are suffering from in hospitals as pneumonia, but let's read on. So he goes on to say there in the highlighted bit how journalists are shouting, more ventilators, we need more ventilators, and the government are kind of taking the cue and ordering more ventilators en masse. You've seen Trump talk about it, Boris talking about getting Dyson to make the ventilators, and McLaren, etc., etc. So this doctor is a critical care physician. He specializes in the use of ventilators. And so he thinks that the clamor is nothing more than panic buying of ventilators, just as people were panic buying toilet paper. He says ventilators are not a cure. They certainly can fill lungs with air when people are unable to do so themselves. they're associated with lung disease in the public's perception, but he says most commonly they're actually used when people are like in a coma, when they've had major abdominal surgery or a head injury, when they have neurological disorders like Guillain-Barré syndrome, when there's some sort of drug intoxication. So he says basically the ventilator pushes fresh air containing oxygen into healthy lungs, which then transmit oxygen to the bloodstream. So he says when a person's got a severe lung problem, then some proportion of lung tissue is still receiving air when they breathe, but it's not transmitting the oxygen into the bloodstream. And so to compensate for this malfunctioning lung tissue because of the disease that's going on, the person breathes harder and faster, like they're running a marathon, and this kind of leads to lung fatigue, and the lungs eventually fail because it's like, you know, running a marathon all the time. So he has to kind of identify people before their lungs stop working so that he can put a plastic tube down their windpipe, hook it up to a ventilator. But he said hooking people up to ventilators is predicated on the hope that there will be something to treat the lung problem and therefore liberate them from the ventilator. And this typically involves antibiotics if it's a bacterial pneumonia. But you know, with COVID, it's still kind of the jury's out because there's no real treatment. So he says because there's no treatment for COVID, it's at least conceivable that putting patients on ventilators could be a bridge to nowhere. So he quotes from Dr. Paul Mayo, who's New York City's most illustrious critical care doctor, and he says that putting a person on a ventilator creates a disease known as being on a ventilator. In other words, it creates a dependency. And so when, you know, they're mechanically kind of blowing all this air into the damaged lungs harder and faster, it can create a ventilator-induced lung injury. Now, just reading that about blowing air into damaged lungs harder and faster, I actually just heard an item on Sky News where they were saying that that was desirable, to blow air harder and fast into lungs. I don't think, you know, maybe, well, they should read this article maybe before they, and add a caveat. So generally, for a person to tolerate this, they have to be sedated, which leads to immobility, severe weakness. And here's the problem, and you'll see it reiterated again later. Once this sedated, people with a ventilator can't cough, they can't clear their airway, and this can lead to a bacterial pneumonia developing in the lungs. So as you'll see an article I've got later, often being on a ventilator causes pneumonia. All right, so as the article says, this is an awful lot to survive. So the New England Journal of Medicine published a case series of very ill COVID patients, 20 of whom went onto a ventilator. Only 4 got off it. 9 died. 3 were kind of in suspended animation, just going on and on and on. That's why you're beginning to hear about people staying on a ventilator for so many weeks, and that's why the death rate is maybe 3 to 4 weeks behind the case rate, because these people are kept alive but don't really have a viable future. As you can see on the screen, their data from the NHS was broadly in line with what was found in Seattle. A lot of the COVID patients who left ICU, only 1/3 were alive. So, you know, not many people who ventilated, well, not many, I mean 2/3 it looks like there, don't kind of move on. So he says simply, we just don't know how many lives ventilators can and will save. 2/3 of attempts fail in the short term. Of the remaining third, we don't know how many were actually successful in the medium to long term. And so maybe this whole rush to buy ventilators is not the panacea, it's not the solution as is being kind of thrust at us. Now, just a New York physician called Cameron Carl Siddell, he has posted a few videos on YouTube, and he's saying that people need to recognize that COVID-19 is not a pneumonia disease at all. Remember, I was questioning it. Is it pneumonia? He says it's like oxygen deprivation, and he likened it to going up Mount Everest and not being properly adapted to the high altitude, how you'd be short of breath. And he says the ventilators might do more harm than good with many patients, especially due to the high pressure methods, you know, that they're running. So, as I say, I've watched his videos, and it's quite interesting to see there. So the next thing we can always talk about to do with this is the statistics, and of course so many countries have vastly different statistics. The reason the German death rate is so low is because they classify people on what they would have died of anyway. They don't take the straw that broke the camel's back kind of thing, where if the COVID is the straw, that's what's linked to the death. No, they look at the underlying causes which were leading to the person's demise anyway. Now, the list of notifiable diseases, these mean diseases that must appear on a death certificate, has been updated in UK law. So the list contains things like smallpox, anthrax, plague, rabies, which most people have never seen, but now it's been amended to include COVID, but not flu.